The atmosphere backstage at Lakewood Church was thick with tension, every breath laced with unease. A towering security guard's hand hovered inches from Senator John Kennedy's shoulder, the crowd of 50,000 buzzing just beyond the curtain. One wrong move here could spark something monumental, something that would shake the very foundations of modern Christianity. Kennedy stood firm, his calm presence radiating years of hard-earned authority. The head of security leaned in, his voice sharp with urgency. "Mr. Kennedy, Pastor Osteen requests that you leave immediately." But John Kennedy wasn't a man to back down. He hadn't come here for a photo op or a polished sermon. He had come prepared, meticulously prepared, with a truth that could no longer be hidden. He looked the guard in the eye and, with a faint smile of compassion mixed with iron resolve, said, "Tell Joel, I have a message for his people. And nothing is going to stop me from delivering it." Cameras caught everything. Within minutes, clips went viral. Millions would soon be asking the same piercing question. What if the promises of prosperity were built not on faith, but on profit? "If you're ready to uncover the truth, Joel," Osteen tried to silence, "hit like hey right now, and drop a in the comments to show you're with us." It all began weeks earlier with a phone call. Joel Osteen's personal assistant, her voice warm and honeyed, invited Kennedy to speak at Lakewood's Sunday service. Imagine the impact, Senator. 50,000 people inspired by your words on purpose and blessings. On the surface, it sounded like an honor, but Kennedy's instincts, honed by decades in politics, told him otherwise. The heavy emphasis on abundant blessings and financial favor felt rehearsed, scripted, and designed for something more than inspiration. So Kennedy agreed, but on his terms. For weeks, he dug into Osteen's teachings, the ministry's finances, and most importantly, the stories of those who had believed, given, and lost. What he uncovered was devastating. Families handing over their last dollars, expecting miracles, only to face eviction. Elderly congregants skipping food and medicine, convinced their seed would multiply. And then came the story that broke him. Margaret Chen, 82 years old, a grandmother from Kennedy's own Louisiana. For months, she sent her entire Social Security check to Lakewood, trusting Osteen's words that her generosity would unlock God's floodgates. Instead, Margaret froze to death in her apartment after her utilities were cut off. Her final note, written by her granddaughter, read, "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher." Those words weighed on Kennedy like a stone. This wasn't just misguided theology, it was exploitation. A system preying on the weak, wrapped in polished sermons and stage lights. And so, when Kennedy walked onto that stage at Lakewood, he didn't come to flatter. He came with a mission to stand for the voiceless, to confront a machine that had traded faith for fortune. As a senator who had built his career on defending the people of Louisiana, John Kennedy saw Margaret's story as more than just a tragedy. It was a call to action, a summons to stand for those who had been misled and exploited. If he truly embodied the values he preached, fairness, accountability, and protection for the powerless, then silence was not an option. The Jesus Kennedy had read about in Scripture, the one who lifted the poor, condemned the greedy, and unmasked hypocrisy, would not have turned away, and neither could John Kennedy. Margaret's suffering wasn't an isolated story. It was the voice of countless others who had been told that poverty meant failure, and that struggle was a punishment for weak faith. It was betrayal disguised as blessing. The night before his scheduled appearance at Lakewood, Kennedy sat alone in his hotel room. No rehearsed speech, no polished talking points, just hours of deep reflection. This wasn't about politics or scoring points. It was about standing up for people like Margaret Chen, whose trust had been weaponized in the name of faith. In that silence, Kennedy asked himself a single question. What does integrity look like in a place where profit seems to outweigh people? He thought of the widows, the families, the elderly who had given their last dollar, believing promises of prosperity. He thought of the scriptures calling for justice, for care of the poor, for accountability of the powerful. When dawn broke, Kennedy was ready, not as a politician, but as a voice for the voiceless. At Lakewood, the atmosphere was tense. Security teams hovered nearby, their presence a silent warning. Soon, the head of security approached with 2 men at his side. "Mr. Kennedy," the guard said, his tone uneasy. "There's been a change of plans. Pastor Joel has asked us to escort you out." Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. The guards stiffened, only to relax when they saw it was a handwritten note. "Before I leave," Kennedy said firmly, "I have a message from Margaret Chen's granddaughter." He unfolded the paper and began to read, his voice steady but heavy with truth. "My grandmother died believing God had abandoned her, because Pastor Joel taught that hardship was a failure of faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and froze in the cold. Please tell people the truth." The words fell like a stone into silence. The guards, trained to diffuse conflict, found themselves shaken, unable to look away from Kennedy's conviction. He folded the note with care, then locked eyes with each guard. "Gentlemen, you can escort me out, and I'll go peacefully. But if you silence her story, you become part of the system that caused her suffering." A crackle on the radio broke the silence. Joel Osteen's voice, tense and commanding, "Get him out now, before the service starts." But Kennedy only smiled, calm, resolute, unwavering. "Tell Joel," he said, his voice echoing with authority, "that Margaret Chen's story deserves to be heard. And nothing will stop that." In that moment, hesitation rippled through the guards. The weight of truth was stronger than their orders. What happened next would be recorded on dozens of phones, shared millions of times, and remembered as the moment a senator stood against silence. Kennedy had turned a backstage confrontation into a turning point, a challenge to the very heart of what faith and leadership should mean in a world too easily swayed by promises of prosperity. He wasn't there to perform or win applause. John Kennedy came to give a voice to people like Margaret Chen, whose stories had been buried under the glitter of prosperity promises. The attempt to remove him hadn't failed because of resistance or force. It failed because of something stronger, the quiet, undeniable power of truth. And that truth was what Kennedy carried with him, even as it made seasoned guards pause. As he straightened his jacket, he could feel the weight of Margaret Chen's granddaughter's handwritten note resting safely inside his pocket. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a responsibility he had chosen to bear. This wasn't politics. This wasn't personal gain. It was about standing for the vulnerable, for the people of Louisiana and beyond, who had been misled into believing faith was measured in dollars. Kennedy's preparation hadn't been about crafting talking points. It was about grounding himself in the principles that had defined his career: fairness, accountability, and a fierce commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. And now, those principles were about to be tested, not against a rival senator or a political opponent, but against the powerful machinery of a ministry built on polished promises and profitable faith. Stay with me. Because when a man of principle steps into a system fueled by profit, the collision is nothing short of seismic. What John Kennedy chose to do next would set the stage for a confrontation that echoed far beyond Lakewood's gleaming walls. His preparation had begun weeks earlier, long before he stepped into Houston. It started with a single phone call, a polished invitation from Joel Osteen's assistant, asking Kennedy to share his on-sites at Lakewood. From the moment he heard the words, abundant blessings, and financial favor, Kennedy's instincts kicked in. He wasn't one to take things at face value. Not when the trust of thousands was on the line. Night after night, he pored over Joel Osteen's sermons, financial filings, and, most importantly, the testimonies of those who had given everything in faith, only to be left with nothing. The stories painted a devastating picture. Families who had lost their homes after draining their savings. Single mothers who went hungry to send money to Lakewood in hopes of a miracle. And elderly believers like Margaret Chen, who had sacrificed survival itself for the promise of blessing. Each account added weight to his resolve. And Margaret's story, the Louisiana grandmother who died in the cold after giving her Social Security checks to Lakewood, was the cornerstone. Her granddaughter's haunting words, "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher," were not just a tragedy. They were a call to action. Kennedy knew these weren't statistics. They were real lives, real pain. Many from communities he had sworn to serve, and he realized this wasn't simply a matter of theology. It was about justice. So he turned not to politics, but to Scripture, not as a performance, but as a guide. He reflected on passages warning of those who devour widows' houses, and on teachings that placed true treasure not in wealth, but in service. The night before the event, Kennedy didn't rehearse. He didn't draft applause lines. Instead, he sat in silence, Margaret's letter pressing heavy on his heart. He asked himself the only question that mattered. What does integrity look like in a place that prizes profit over people? By dawn, his answer was clear. He wasn't walking into Lakewood as a guest speaker. He was walking in as a voice for the silenced, armed with nothing but truth and conviction. And when the day came, John Kennedy entered Lakewood Church with a quiet but unshakable determination. The backstage air was polished, rehearsed, but tense. Security stood watch, their presence a reminder that his very presence had already unsettled the room. Then the head of security approached. Two men flanking him. His tone was professional, but Kennedy caught the hesitation in his eyes. "Mr. Kennedy," the guard said, "there's been a change of plans." Pastor Joel's voice crackled through the guard's radios. "Escort him out." But Kennedy didn't flinch. Calmly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The guards stiffened, only to ease when they saw it was nothing more than a handwritten note. Kennedy's voice rang out steady, the voice of a man who had faced down Senate battles and wasn't about to back away now. "Before I leave, I have a message from Margaret Chen's granddaughter." He unfolded the note, his words sharp and deliberate. "My grandmother died believing God had forsaken her, because Pastor Joel taught that hardship means a lack of faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and froze in the cold. Please tell people the truth." The silence that followed was crushing. The weight of a broken life and betrayed trust filled the air. Even the guards, trained to confront chaos, stood frozen, caught off guard by the moral force behind Kennedy's calm defiance. Folding the note with care, he looked each guard in the eye. "Gentlemen, you can take me out peacefully. But know this, Margaret Chen suffered because your leader preaches that struggle is failure. If you silence her story, you become part of that lie." The radio crackled again with urgency, Joel Osteen demanding, "Get him out before the service begins." The guards stepped forward, yet their hesitation was visible. They weren't facing a protester. They were facing a man unarmed except with truth. And then Kennedy smiled, not with anger, not with defiance, but with compassion, the kind only earned by fighting for those who cannot speak for themselves. "Tell Joel," he said, voice resonating through the room, That Margaret Chen's story deserves to be heard, and nothing will stop it. The guards faltered. Phones rose across the room, recording history in real time. Kennedy wasn't grandstanding, he was standing for principle. That note was more than paper. It was the voice of every soul hurt by hollow promises, and his conviction cracked through the polished walls of Lakewood like thunder. Moments later, the heavy sanctuary doors swung open. Senator John Kennedy walked the center aisle, every step deliberate, cutting through the smooth sermon of abundance Joel Osteen had just begun. 50,000 people turned, the murmur swelling like a storm as cameras rolled, broadcasting this confrontation across the world. Kennedy carried no microphone, yet his presence commanded silence. A man of principle stepping into a temple of profit. A senator from Louisiana standing not for power but for truth. The weight of it was undeniable. Stay with me. Because what John Kennedy said next would ignite a movement far larger than Lakewood's walls. This is from the granddaughter of Margaret Chen, an 82-year-old woman from Louisiana. Kennedy's voice was steady, each word slicing through the polished atmosphere of Lakewood. Margaret died alone in a cold apartment. Her utilities were cut off because she gave her last dollars to this ministry, believing faith would bring financial blessings. She trusted that sacrifice would unlock divine favor. But instead, she suffered while this church thrived. The silence was suffocating. A congregation used to messages of hope and abundance now faced a truth that stripped away the gloss. Kennedy's compassion made Margaret's loss undeniable, forcing thousands to confront the human cost of teachings they had embraced. He turned his gaze to Joel Osteen, rigid behind his podium. Pastor Joel, Margaret believed poverty was proof of spiritual failure. She gave everything, and it cost her life. How many more have suffered while being told their struggles are a lack of faith? The words landed like lightning. Whispers spread. Some wiped away tears. Others looked shaken. Kennedy opened a worn Bible, pages marked from study. In Matthew 19, Jesus told a rich man, "Sell your possessions, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." Then he said, "It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter God's kingdom." Pastor Joel, when was the last time you preached that verse? Osteen's voice trembled. John, you're taking this out of context. Kennedy pressed forward, calm but unwavering. Then let's add context. Jesus never promised wealth, he said. In this world you will have trouble. He called his followers to give to the poor, to store treasures in heaven, not here on earth. And he warned against those who exploit the vulnerable for gain. The arena stirred. Tears, confusion, even anger. Some rose to their feet, others whispered frantic prayers. And then, something no one expected. Members of the worship team set down their instruments. The lead singer's voice shook as she took the mic. "We can't sing about a God who promises wealth. Jesus preached sacrifice, we're done." One by one, they walked off stage. The crowd erupted, shock, tears, even cheers at the courage of truth. Kennedy held up the note again. This woman thought her poverty meant God abandoned her. But Jesus himself was born in a stable, lived without a home, and died with nothing. Faith was never measured by riches. It was measured by love, compassion, and how we treat the least among us. Margaret Chen's sacrifice showed more faith than many who profited from her pain. Osteen's face was pale, sweat on his brow. He tried to regain control, but his voice was drowned by a restless crowd. Some canceled their donations on their phones. Others gave money directly to strangers beside them. Tears and prayers flowed. Kennedy stepped forward, cutting through the chaos. This isn't about me. This is about Margaret Chen and the countless others who gave everything and were left with nothing. It's about what faith truly means. Not wealth, but truth. Not abundance, but love. The stage no longer belonged to Osteen. It belonged to the truth that Kennedy had unleashed. Cracks in prosperity preaching spread like wildfire, broadcast to millions. And as the sanctuary wrestled with a choice, cling to comfort or embrace conviction, one thing was certain: stay with me. Because John Kennedy wasn't just challenging a preacher. he was confronting a system, forcing millions to choose between easy promises and the hard, authentic path of real faith.